My nanny coached my son to lie to CPS in Spanish, not knowing I'm fluent. I was standing in the kitchen making coffee when I heard my nanny Claudia talking to my 4-year-old son Oliver in rapid Spanish through the baby monitor. The device was supposed to be for nap time, but I'd left it on by accident that morning. Her voice came through clear and urgent, speaking faster than I'd ever heard her talk before. She was teaching him a script, repeating phrases over and over until he could say them back perfectly. When the lady comes to talk to you, you say your papa never hits you. You say he's a good papa. You say mama is the one who gets angry. My hand froze on the coffee pot, and I felt ice water flood my veins as I processed what I was hearing. Claudia had been our nanny for 8 months, recommended by a friend from my yoga class who'd used her for years. She was in her mid-50s, warm and motherly, always arriving on time with homemade empanadas for Oliver. My wife Diana and I both worked demanding jobs, me as a software architect and her as a hospital administrator, so having reliable childcare felt like winning the lottery. Claudia spoke limited English, which had never been an issue because Oliver was learning Spanish anyway, and I'd grown up in a bilingual household in Southern California. My mother was from Guadalajara and had insisted all her children speak perfect Spanish, drilling us with vocabulary and grammar throughout our childhood. But I'd never mentioned this to Claudia because she seemed more comfortable speaking English around me, and I didn't want to make her self-conscious about her language skills. Now I stood frozen in my kitchen at 6:30 in the morning, listening to her coach my son on what to tell Child Protective Services, and my brain couldn't make sense of why CPS would be coming to talk to Oliver at all. Repite, mi amor. Claudia's voice continued through the monitor. Tu papa es bueno. Tu mama se enoja mucho. Oliver's small voice repeated the words back to her, stumbling over the pronunciation, but getting the meaning across. Your papa is good. Your mama gets angry a lot. I set down my coffee cup carefully, so I wouldn't drop it, and pressed the volume button on the monitor to make sure I was hearing this correctly. Claudia was still talking, her voice patient but insistent, explaining to Oliver that a nice lady would come ask him questions, and he needed to remember exactly what to say. She told him it was like a game, like when they practiced his ABCs, except this was even more important because it would help keep him safe. My 4-year-old son was being coached to lie to government authorities, and the person doing it was someone we trusted completely with his care. I grabbed my phone and started recording the audio from the monitor, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped the device. Claudia was moving on to different scenarios now, asking Oliver what he would say if the lady asked about bruises or asked if Mommy ever scared him. Oliver kept giving the wrong answers, saying he didn't have bruises, and Mommy only got mad when he didn't clean his toys, and Claudia would gently correct him each time. No, Michiello, you have to say Mommy gets very angry and sometimes you're scared. Can you say that for me? Oliver repeated it back in his sweet, trusting voice, and I felt rage building in my chest that made it hard to breathe normally. This woman was teaching my baby to accuse his mother of abuse, programming him like a computer with false memories and scripted responses. I saved the recording and immediately started a new one, making sure I captured every word of this conversation before Claudia realized I could hear them. She spent another 10 minutes drilling Oliver on his responses, praising him when he got the script right and patiently correcting him when he deviated from what she wanted him to say. The whole thing was methodical and practiced, like she'd done this before and knew exactly how to manipulate a small child into believing a false narrative. When she finally seemed satisfied with his performance, I heard her tell Oliver they should go downstairs for breakfast, and I quickly shut off the monitor and tried to compose my face into something normal. My mind was racing through possibilities, trying to understand what the hell was happening in my house and why our nanny was preparing my son for a CPS interview we knew nothing about. Had someone reported us? Was Claudia setting us up for something? The sound of footsteps on the stairs made me turn toward the doorway with my coffee cup in hand, trying to look casual despite the adrenaline screaming through my system. Claudia walked into the kitchen with Oliver holding her hand, both of them smiling like this was just another normal morning in our household. She greeted me warmly in her accented English, asking if I wanted her to make breakfast or if I'd already eaten. Oliver ran over to hug my legs, chattering about the cartoon he wanted to watch, completely oblivious to the fact that he'd just been programmed to destroy his mother's life. I picked him up and held him close, studying his innocent face for any sign that he understood what Claudia had been teaching him, but he was just my normal happy kid asking if he could have chocolate chip pancakes. Claudia started pulling out ingredients from the pantry, humming to herself while I sat Oliver at the kitchen table with his coloring books. Every movement she made felt sinister now, every smile hiding something calculated and cruel. I excused myself to use the bathroom and instead went to my home office, locking the door behind me and immediately calling Diana at the hospital. She answered on the third ring, her voice distracted because she was probably in the middle of morning rounds. I kept my voice low and told her we had an emergency with Claudia, that I'd recorded something extremely disturbing and needed her to come home as soon as possible. Diana's voice shifted instantly from distracted to focused, asking if Oliver was okay and if she should call the police. I told her Oliver was physically fine, but we needed to talk privately before making any decisions about next steps. She said she'd be home in 40 minutes and to keep everything normal until she arrived. I went back downstairs and found Claudia making pancakes, while Oliver colored a picture of a dinosaur, the scene so domestic and peaceful it made my stomach turn. I sat at the table with my son and tried to make small talk with Claudia, asking about her plans for the day and whether she needed me to pick anything up from the store. She chatted normally about taking Oliver to the park if the weather stayed nice, maybe stopping by the library for new books. Her performance was flawless, not a hint of the manipulation I'd witnessed through the monitor an hour earlier. When Diana's car pulled into the driveway earlier than expected, Claudia looked surprised but pleased, commenting that it was nice she could join us for breakfast. Diana came through the door with her work bag still on her shoulder and her badge from the hospital clipped to her scrubs. She smiled at Claudia and Oliver, but I could see the tension around her eyes, the way her jaw was clenched tight beneath the pleasant expression. I suggested Oliver might want to watch cartoons in the living room, and Claudia immediately offered to set him up with his favorite show. Once they were out of the kitchen, Diana grabbed my arm hard enough to leave marks and demanded to know what was going on. I pulled out my phone and played her the recording, watching her face cycle through confusion, then shock, then pure rage as she listened to Claudia coaching our son to accuse her of abuse. Diana's hands started shaking, and she had to sit down at the kitchen table, pressing her palms flat against the wood to steady herself. She whispered that this couldn't be real, that there had to be some explanation, but I played the recording again, and there was no misunderstanding Claudia's intentions. My wife looked at me with tears in her eyes and asked why our nanny would do this to us, what we'd ever done to deserve being set up like this. I had no answers, just the sick feeling in my gut that we'd invited someone dangerous into our home and given her unrestricted access to our child. Diana wanted to confront Claudia immediately, but I convinced her we needed to be smart about this and document everything before making any moves. I suggested we call a lawyer first to understand our legal options and figure out whether CPS had actually been contacted or if Claudia was preparing for something she planned to do in the future. Diana agreed reluctantly, pulling out her phone to search for family law attorneys while I went back to check on Oliver and Claudia in the living room. They were sitting together on the couch watching animated characters sing about friendship, Oliver cuddled up against Claudia like she was his grandmother. The contrast between this sweet scene and the sinister coaching session from this morning made me feel physically ill, and I had to force myself to smile and ask if anyone needed snacks. Claudia said they were fine, and that she'd make Oliver lunch in a little while, her voice so caring and genuine that I almost doubted my own ears about what I'd heard earlier. But the recording on my phone was real, and whatever game Claudia was playing, we needed to figure it out before she destroyed our family. Diana found a lawyer who could see us that afternoon, and I told Claudia that we needed to run some errands and would take Oliver with us. She looked disappointed, mentioning she'd planned activities for the afternoon, but accepted our decision with grace. I grabbed Oliver and we left the house, not trusting Claudia alone there even for a few hours. We drove to the lawyer's office in tense silence, Oliver chattering in the back seat about wanting to go to the park. The attorney's name was Patricia Volkov, and her office was in a converted house downtown with comfortable furniture and children's toys in the waiting room. She was in her early 60s with sharp eyes and an efficient manner, listening to our story without interruption while taking detailed notes. When I played her the recording, she closed her eyes briefly and then asked permission to make a copy for her files. Patricia explained that what Claudia was doing could constitute several crimes, including child abuse, witness tampering, and conspiracy to file a false report. She asked if we had any idea why Claudia would target our family specifically, and we both shook our heads in complete confusion. Patricia walked us through our options methodically, starting with the fact that we should not confront Claudia directly or fire her yet, because that could spook her into filing a CPS report immediately with Oliver already coached on his false testimony. She suggested we continue acting normal while gathering more evidence about Claudia's intentions and connections. Patricia recommended installing security cameras in our home to document any further coaching sessions, and she wanted us to start keeping a detailed log of all interactions with Claudia, including dates, times, and witnesses to her behavior with Oliver. She also advised us to schedule a wellness check with Oliver's pediatrician to document his current physical and emotional state, creating a baseline record before any accusations were made. Diana asked what would happen if CPS showed up at our door tomorrow, and Patricia's face grew serious as she explained that even false accusations could result in investigations, interviews with Oliver at school, and potential removal of our child during the investigation period. The system was designed to protect children, which meant sometimes innocent families got caught up in nightmarish scenarios where they had to prove their innocence. Patricia said our best defense was documentation, witnesses, and getting ahead of whatever Claudia was planning. We left her office with an action plan and a sick feeling that our lives had become a legal thriller we never auditioned for. I called my mother from the car and asked if she and my father could come visit for a few days, using a family emergency as the excuse without going into details over the phone. My parents lived 2 hours away in Orange County, and my mother immediately said they'd drive up that evening and stay as long as we needed them. Having them in the house would provide additional witnesses to our parenting and to Claudia's behavior. Plus, my mother's Spanish fluency meant she could monitor conversations I might miss. Diana contacted Oliver's preschool and set up a meeting with his teacher for the next morning, explaining that we wanted to document his current behavior and emotional state for our records. The teacher, a kind woman named Leslie who'd taught for 20 years, seemed surprised by the urgent request, but agreed to write up a detailed assessment of Oliver's development and any concerns she'd noticed. We spent that evening installing hidden cameras throughout our house, small devices that looked like phone chargers and smoke detectors, but recorded everything happening in the main rooms. I felt sleazy doing it, like I was violating Claudia's privacy, but Patricia had been clear that we needed video evidence of any coaching sessions or suspicious behavior. My parents arrived around 8 o'clock with suitcases and concerned faces, and I filled them in on the situation after Oliver was asleep. My mother's face went white with rage as I played her the recording, and she started cursing in Spanish about people who hurt children and families. My father, normally calm and measured, suggested we call the police immediately and have Claudia arrested, but I explained Patricia's advice about not spooking her before we understood the full scope of her plan. My mother asked if I'd searched online for information about Claudia, and I realized with a sinking feeling that we'd done only the most basic background check when we hired her. Our friend Bethany had vouched for her enthusiastically, and Claudia had provided references from 2 other families she'd worked for previously. I'd called both references, and they'd given glowing reviews, praising Claudia's reliability and affection for their children. Now I wondered if those references were even real, or if we'd been so desperate for good childcare that we'd skipped important verification steps. My father opened his laptop, and we started searching Claudia's full name, Claudia Mendoza, which was unfortunately common enough that hundreds of results came up. We tried adding our city and state, then her approximate age, then combinations of words like nanny and childcare. After 2 hours of searching, we found something that made my blood run cold. A news article from 3 years ago in a city about 90 miles north mentioned a custody battle where a nanny named Claudia Mendoza had testified against a mother, claiming she'd witnessed abuse in the home. The mother had lost custody temporarily while the case was investigated, but eventually the charges were dropped, and the nanny was found to have fabricated evidence at the request of the father, who was trying to gain full custody during a contentious divorce. The article didn't include a photo, but the age and description matched our Claudia, and the article mentioned she'd worked as a nanny for over 20 years in various California cities. Diana read the article 3 times, her face getting paler with each reading, and then asked the obvious question that was haunting all of us. Why would Claudia do this to multiple families? What did she gain from destroying mothers and coaching children to lie? My father suggested money, that maybe fathers were paying her to help them win custody battles by framing their wives as abusive. My mother thought it might be psychological, some kind of disturbed need to control families or punish women. I had no idea, but I knew we needed to find out if our family was specifically targeted or if we were just unlucky enough to hire a predator. I sent the article to Patricia with a message explaining we'd found a possible match for our nanny's background, and she responded within minutes, saying she'd have her investigator look into it first thing in the morning. That night I barely slept, lying awake next to Diana and listening to every creak in the house, wondering if Claudia was coaching Oliver in his sleep or planting evidence we hadn't discovered yet. At 6 in the morning, I gave up on sleep and went downstairs to make coffee, checking the hidden camera footage from overnight. Nothing unusual showed up, just empty rooms and the normal sounds of a house settling. Claudia arrived at her usual time of 7:30, greeting my parents warmly and not seeming surprised or suspicious about their sudden visit. She explained to my mother in Spanish that she was Oliver's nanny and had been working with the family for several months, and my mother responded in perfect Spanish that it was lovely to meet her, and she'd heard wonderful things. I watched Claudia's face carefully when my mother spoke Spanish, looking for any flicker of concern that another Spanish speaker was now in the house, but Claudia just smiled and continued the conversation naturally. She asked my mother about her life in Orange County and complimented her accent, saying it sounded like she was from Jalisco. My mother confirmed she was originally from Guadalajara, and they chatted about the region for a few minutes before Claudia excused herself to get Oliver ready for preschool. I followed her upstairs casually, mentioning I needed to grab something from my office, but really wanting to observe how she interacted with Oliver now that we were watching. She woke him gently, speaking in Spanish about what a big day it would be and how the nice teacher would want to hear all about his family. My stomach clenched at that phrase, wondering if she was still coaching him or if I was reading sinister intent into innocent words. Oliver got dressed and came downstairs for breakfast, climbing into my mother's lap and asking her in English if she'd read him stories later. My mother hugged him tight and promised they'd read all his favorites, and I saw tears in her eyes when Oliver wasn't looking. We all knew what was at stake here, that if Claudia succeeded in her plan, this little boy could be taken from us based on lies and manipulation. Diana left for work, looking exhausted and terrified, hugging Oliver extra long before she went out the door. I told Claudia I'd be working from home today, setting up my laptop at the kitchen table where I could monitor the main floor while pretending to focus on code. My mother busied herself with cooking and cleaning, staying close to Oliver whenever Claudia was with him. My father read the newspaper in the living room, but I could see him watching Claudia over the top of the pages, his expression harder than usual. The morning passed slowly with no incidents, just normal nanny activities like playing blocks and reading books. But around noon, while I was on a video call with my team and my parents were both upstairs, I saw through my peripheral vision that Claudia had taken Oliver into the playroom and closed the door. My heart rate spiked immediately, and I ended the call abruptly, walking quickly toward the playroom. I could hear Claudia speaking Spanish inside, her voice low and urgent again, and I pressed my ear against the door to listen. She was reviewing the script from yesterday, asking Oliver if he remembered what to say when the nice lady came to visit, reminding him that it was important to protect Papa from Mama's anger. I felt rage surge through my chest so intense that my vision actually blurred at the edges, and I had to force myself not to kick down the door and physically throw this woman out of my house. Instead, I knocked loudly and opened the door with a bright smile, asking in English if they wanted to join me for lunch. Claudia's face was smooth and pleasant when she turned to face me, no trace of guilt or concern, and Oliver bounced over talking about the puzzle they'd been working on. I led them both back to the kitchen where my parents had returned downstairs, and I made sandwiches while my mother engaged Claudia in conversation about her family and background. Claudia talked easily about growing up in Mexico City, moving to California in her 20s, working various jobs before settling into childcare. She mentioned she had adult children of her own living in different states, and that she'd been married twice but was single now. Everything she said sounded normal and truthful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were talking to a skilled actress who'd perfected her cover story over decades. After lunch, I suggested we all go to the park together, wanting to keep Oliver and Claudia in constant supervision. Claudia looked slightly annoyed at the suggestion, mentioning she usually took Oliver alone so he could play freely, but agreed when my parents enthusiastically said they'd love to join. At the park, I watched Claudia interact with other nannies and parents, noting how she positioned herself as the loving grandmother figure, talking about her boy and how special he was. She introduced Oliver to other children and encouraged him to play on the equipment while she sat on a bench with 2 other caregivers. I moved closer, pretending to push Oliver on the swings while actually listening to their conversation. The other women were complaining about their employer families, one talking about a mother who micromanaged everything and another mentioning a father who was never home. Claudia joined in, saying some parents just didn't appreciate how hard childcare work was, and that sometimes nannies had to protect children from their own parents' mistakes. The way she said it made my skin crawl, like she genuinely believed she was some kind of savior rescuing children from inadequate mothers. I wondered how many families she'd targeted over the years, how many mothers had lost custody or been investigated based on her false testimony. When we got home, Patricia called with an update from her investigator. They'd confirmed that the Claudia Mendoza from the news article 3 years ago was almost certainly our Claudia based on age, physical description, and employment history. The investigator had also found 2 other similar cases in nearby counties where a nanny matching her description had testified against mothers during custody disputes. In both cases, the accusations were eventually proven false, but not before the mothers endured months of investigation and restricted access to their children. Patricia said this pattern suggested Claudia was either working with fathers who hired her specifically to build cases against their wives, or she was acting independently with some kind of psychological motivation. Either way, we needed to figure out if there was a father in our social circle who might be coordinating with Claudia, or if she'd chosen our family randomly. I told Patricia that Diana and I had a solid marriage with no custody concerns, no history of domestic violence, nothing that would make us targets for this kind of scheme. Patricia asked if I'd had any recent conflicts with friends or colleagues, anyone who might have a grudge, and I couldn't think of anything significant. Diana came home early from the hospital and we sent Claudia home for the day, saying we wanted family time with my parents. Claudia accepted this smoothly, gathering her things and reminding Oliver to practice his letters before tomorrow. After she left, we sat around the kitchen table reviewing everything we knew and trying to find the connection we were missing. Diana suddenly sat up straight and asked if I remembered Bethany's ex-husband, the friend who'd recommended Claudia in the first place. I searched my memory and vaguely recalled that Bethany had gone through a divorce about 2 years ago, something contentious, involving custody of their daughter. Diana pulled out her phone and started searching through old text messages, finding the conversation where Bethany had first mentioned Claudia. The recommendation had come right in the middle of Bethany's divorce, and now that I thought about it, Bethany had primary custody of her daughter, despite her ex-husband's attempts to prove she was an unfit mother. My father asked if Bethany's ex had accused her of abuse during their custody battle, and Diana said she remembered Bethany mentioning that her ex had claimed she had anger issues and was too strict with their daughter. The pieces were starting to connect in a way that made my stomach turn. What if Claudia had been hired by Bethany's ex-husband to testify against her, but Bethany had somehow won anyway, and now Claudia was trying to rehabilitate her reputation by working for families that Bethany recommended? If we'd hired Claudia on Bethany's glowing recommendation, and then CPS showed up investigating Diana for abuse, it would look like Bethany had unknowingly vouched for a nanny who later witnessed genuine problems in our home. I called Bethany immediately and asked if we could come over to talk about something important regarding Claudia. Bethany sounded worried but agreed, and within 30 minutes Diana and I were sitting in her living room while my parents watched Oliver at our house. Bethany was a petite woman in her late 30s with dark circles under her eyes that spoke of the stress she'd been through during her divorce. I asked her directly if Claudia had ever been involved in her custody case, and Bethany's face went pale. She admitted that her ex-husband, a man named Jeffrey Blake, had hired Claudia specifically to document evidence of Bethany's supposed abuse and neglect. Claudia had worked for them for 3 months during the divorce, and Jeffrey had planned to use her testimony to get full custody of their daughter, Emma. But before the custody hearing, Bethany's lawyer had discovered that Claudia had a history of providing false testimony in other cases, and they'd threatened to expose her in court. Jeffrey and Claudia had backed off, and the custody agreement had been settled with Bethany getting primary placement. Bethany started crying, saying she'd recommended Claudia to us as a way of proving she held no grudges and believed Claudia deserved a second chance. She'd thought Claudia had been manipulated by Jeffrey and wasn't truly malicious, and she genuinely believed Claudia would be a good nanny for Oliver. Now she realized she'd put our family in danger by not telling us the full history. Diana asked if Jeffrey was still in contact with Claudia, and Bethany said she didn't know but wouldn't be surprised. We left Bethany's house with more questions than answers, driving back home in silence. If Claudia was working with Jeffrey to target families in Bethany's social circle, what was the end game? Revenge against Bethany for exposing her false testimony? Money from fathers willing to pay for manufactured evidence? Or something darker we hadn't figured out yet? Patricia called that evening with disturbing news. Her investigator had discovered that Jeffrey Blake was part of a men's rights group that connected fathers going through contentious custody battles. Several members of the group had used the same tactic of hiring sympathetic nannies or caregivers who would document evidence against mothers and testify in court. Claudia's name appeared in connection with at least 5 cases over the past 7 years, always working for fathers who were trying to prove their wives were abusive or neglectful. Patricia said this was a coordinated pattern, not random chance, and that we needed to assume Jeffrey and Claudia were specifically targeting our family as retaliation against Bethany. The plan was probably to have CPS investigate Diana based on Claudia's testimony and Oliver's coached statements. And when the investigation disrupted our lives and cost us money in legal fees, it would serve as a warning to other mothers in Bethany's social circle not to expose Claudia's methods. Diana started shaking when she heard this, realizing we'd been targeted as pawns in someone else's revenge plot, and our son had been turned into a weapon against us. I held her while she cried, feeling helpless rage at the people who'd done this to our family. The next morning, I made a decision that Patricia had advised against, but that felt necessary. I was done playing defense and gathering evidence. I wanted to confront Claudia directly and let her know we understood exactly what she was doing. When she arrived at 7:30, I asked her to sit down at the kitchen table before she went upstairs to get Oliver. Claudia looked confused but complied, setting down her bag and folding her hands in her lap. I pulled out my phone and played the recording of her coaching Oliver to lie about Diana. I watched her face carefully as the Spanish words filled the kitchen, and for the first time since we'd met her, I saw Claudia's mask slip. Her expression cycled through shock, then calculation, then cold anger. When the recording ended, I spoke to her in perfect Spanish, telling her I'd understood every word she'd said to my son, every lie she'd taught him, every manipulation she'd attempted. I told her I knew about her history with Jeffrey Blake, about the other families she'd targeted, about the coordinated scheme to destroy mothers through false accusations. Claudia's face had gone completely blank, and she sat perfectly still while I laid out everything we'd discovered. Then she smiled, and it was the most unsettling thing I'd ever seen. She spoke in Spanish, her voice calm and pleasant, saying I'd made a mistake recording her without consent, and that she could have me arrested for wiretapping. She said whatever investigation we thought we were preventing would happen anyway, because she'd already filed a report with CPS yesterday afternoon, claiming she'd witnessed Diana grab Oliver hard enough to leave bruises and scream at him until he was terrified. The CPS worker was scheduled to interview Oliver at his preschool this morning, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. Claudia stood up smoothly, gathering her bag and heading toward the door. She paused in the doorway and said in English that she hoped we'd learned our lesson about interfering in matters we didn't understand, and that she'd make sure Jeffrey knew Bethany's friends weren't as smart as they thought they were. Then she walked out, leaving me standing in the kitchen with my heart racing and my hands shaking. I immediately called Patricia and Diana, explaining what had happened and that CPS was interviewing Oliver this morning. Patricia said to get to the preschool immediately and request to be present during the interview, and that she'd meet us there with documentation of Claudia's history. Diana left the hospital mid-shift, and we both arrived at Oliver's preschool within 20 minutes, finding a CPS investigator named Monica Alvarez already sitting in the director's office. Monica was a tired-looking woman in her 40s who'd probably seen every kind of family dysfunction imaginable, and she listened patiently while we explained the situation with Claudia. I played her the recording of Claudia coaching Oliver, and then Patricia arrived with printed documentation of Claudia's involvement in previous false accusation cases. Monica's expression shifted from professional neutrality to genuine concern as she reviewed the evidence, and she said this definitely changed the context of Claudia's report. She still needed to interview Oliver as part of protocol, but she'd be listening for signs of coaching, rather than assuming the accusations were credible. We waited in the hallway while Monica spoke with Oliver in a private room, his teacher Leslie present as a support person. The 20 minutes felt like 20 hours, and Diana held my hand so tight I lost feeling in my fingers. When Monica emerged, she looked tired but relieved. She said Oliver's responses showed clear signs of rehearsed statements that contradicted his body language and spontaneous comments. When asked about his mother, Oliver had initially given scripted answers about Diana being angry and scary, but when Monica asked follow-up questions, Oliver couldn't provide specific examples and quickly reverted to talking about how Mommy made good cookies and read him stories every night. Monica said she'd be noting in her report that the initial accusation appeared to be fabricated and coached, and that she'd be referring Claudia's case to law enforcement for filing a false report. She also mentioned that Oliver seemed like a happy, well-adjusted child with no signs of abuse or neglect, and that she saw no reason to pursue the investigation further. Diana burst into tears of relief, and I felt something loosen in my chest that had been tight since the morning I'd first heard Claudia's voice through the monitor. Monica asked if we wanted to file charges against Claudia for child abuse, witness tampering, and filing a false report, and I said absolutely yes. She provided us with the name of a detective who specialized in cases involving children and false accusations, and said she'd be sending over all her documentation to support criminal charges. We took Oliver home and spent the rest of the day just holding him, playing with him, reassuring him that everything was okay, and that he never had to see Claudia again. 2 days later, Detective Raymond Foster contacted us to schedule an interview about Claudia's actions. He was a veteran investigator with a calm, methodical approach, and he spent 3 hours going through every piece of evidence we'd gathered. He said this was part of a larger investigation into a network of individuals who were manufacturing false abuse cases for profit and revenge, and that Claudia was a key player they'd been trying to build a case against for years. Our documentation and recordings provided the concrete evidence they needed to finally bring charges. Detective Foster explained that Jeffrey Blake was also being investigated for conspiracy to file false reports, and that several other fathers in his men's rights group were under scrutiny for similar schemes. Within a week, Claudia was arrested at her apartment and charged with multiple felonies, including child abuse, witness tampering, filing false reports, and conspiracy. The bail was set high enough that she couldn't afford it, and she remained in custody while awaiting trial. Jeffrey Blake was arrested the same day on related charges, and the news coverage of the case sparked discussions about the underground market for false testimony and custody battles. Bethany called us crying, apologizing over and over for recommending Claudia and putting our family at risk. We told her it wasn't her fault, that she'd been victimized by these people too, and that hopefully the arrests would prevent them from hurting other families. Diana and I spent months in therapy processing the violation of having someone infiltrate our home and weaponize our child against us, and Oliver needed play therapy to help him understand that the things Claudia taught him to say weren't true and that he hadn't done anything wrong. The trial happened 8 months later, and I had to testify about the recordings and the coaching sessions I'd witnessed. Claudia's defense tried to argue that she'd been trying to protect Oliver from genuine abuse she'd witnessed, but the pattern of her involvement in multiple false accusation cases over the years destroyed her credibility. The jury convicted her on all counts, and the judge sentenced her to 6 years in prison, calling her actions a betrayal of the trust that families place in caregivers. Jeffrey Blake received 4 years for conspiracy and coordination of false reports. After the trial, we moved to a different neighborhood and started fresh with new childcare arrangements, this time doing extensive background checks and only hiring through licensed agencies. Oliver eventually forgot most of what happened with Claudia, his 4-year-old brain thankfully resilient enough to move past the trauma. But Diana and I never forgot how close we came to losing our son to a system designed to protect children, but vulnerable to manipulation by people willing to destroy innocent families. We became advocates for reform in how CPS handles accusations, pushing for better training to recognize coached testimony and patterns of false reporting. If you're still here, you're a true fan. Show some support with a like and subscribe to catch the next one.